Hey guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history's darkest corners. Tonight, we're talking about something that'll make you grateful you weren't born a couple thousand years ago. We're exploring the absolutely brutal fate of unwanted babies in ancient Rome and Greece. And trust me, forget everything Hollywood told you about togas and philosophy. This is the real story. And it's going to mess with your head. So, before you get too comfortable in that chair, smash that like button if you enjoy this kind of historical deep dive. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Seriously, I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a drink. Gonna need a tan. Let's jump into one of humanity's most uncomfortable truths. Picture this, you're a newborn baby. You've just entered the world, crying, helpless, completely dependent on the adults around you. In our modern world, that's usually where the story gets better, right? Hospital rooms, proud parents, maybe some awkward relatives fighting over who gets to hold you first. But imagine if, instead of celebration, your very first moments of life were met with ... silence, cold calculation, a decision that would determine whether you lived to see your first sunrise. Welcome to the ancient world, where being born was just the first hurdle. Surviving your first few days, that was the real challenge. Let's start with you waking up. Except you're not waking up. You're being born. It's around 150 BCE, and you're entering the world in a modest Roman household. The midwife catches you, and here's where things get interesting. In our world, the first question is usually, is it healthy? In ancient Rome, the first question was, do we want it? Your father isn't even in the room yet. That's women's work, they said. But once you're cleaned off and examined, here he comes. And buddy, this guy holds your entire future in his hands. See, in Roman law, something called patria potestas, the power of the father gave him absolute authority over his household. And I mean absolute. He could sell you, exile you, or, well, let's just say his options were pretty much unlimited. Now, before we go further, let me ask you something in the comments below. What do you think determined whether a Roman father would accept his newborn? Wealth, gender, health? Drop your guesses below, because the answer might surprise you. So there you are, a few minutes old, and this bearded guy in a toga walks into the room. The midwife presents you to him like she's showing off a pottery vase at the market. He examines you with all the emotion of someone inspecting fruit for bruises. This moment had a name, Tolere Liberum, to lift up the child. If he literally lifted you up, congratulations, you got to live. If he turned away, well, that's where this story gets dark. The smell in the room is intense, by the way. Olive oil lamps flickering, burning with that greasy smoke. The metallic scent of blood. Sweat from the midwife who's been working all night. And underneath it all, that newborn smell that every parent recognizes. In this case, it might be your last smell if things go badly. Your father is doing math in his head. Can he afford another mouth to feed? If you're a girl, can he afford a dowry in 16 years? If you're a boy, are you strong enough to work the fields or join the army? Are there any obvious deformities that might make you a burden rather than an asset? Yeah, welcome to the world, kid. Your first performance review happens before you're an hour old. Now let's zoom out for a second and talk about why this system existed in the first place. Because it's easy to sit here in 2025, in our world of child protective services and human rights, and judge these ancient people as monsters. But the reality is way more complicated. You're living in a world where about 30% of children die before their 5th birthday, where famines can wipe out entire regions, where a bad harvest means your family starves, where having too many children isn't just inconvenience, it's potentially fatal for everyone. Think about it like this. Imagine if every child you had was a massive financial gamble. No government assistance, no healthcare system, no safety net at all. Every mouth to feed is a risk that could bankrupt your family and doom your other children. Direct address to audience, and here's something that'll blow your mind. This wasn't considered cruel by their standards. This was considered responsible family planning. Wild, right? So you're a Roman father, and you've got to make this decision. Let's walk through the calculation. If you're wealthy, the decision is easier. You can afford to raise most children, though even rich Romans had limits. The poet Pliny wrote about families with 10 or 12 children being considered unusually large, even among the wealthy. But if you're poor, if you're a farmer scratching out a living on a tiny plot of land, or a shopkeeper in the city barely making ends meet, every child represents years of food, clothing, and care before they can contribute anything back. And girls. Girls were particularly at risk because they required dowries to marry. A daughter was essentially a 20-year investment that you then had to pay someone else to take off your hands. From a purely economic standpoint, it was brutal math. The smell of the marketplace fills your nostrils as these thoughts run through your father's head. Roasted nuts, fresh bread, and the less pleasant odors of too many people and animals in too small a space. Life is loud, smelly, and precarious. Your father knows that if he accepts you, he's committing to keeping you alive through diseases that have no cure, through winters that might bring starvation, through all the chaos and uncertainty of ancient life. Okay, so let's say your father looks at you and decides, ... No, he doesn't lift you up. He turns away. What happens next is where this story gets really dark. And I mean really dark. So, if you're squeamish, maybe skip ahead about 30 seconds. I'll put a timestamp in the description. The practice was called exposure. Sounds innocent enough, right? Like you're just being shown around the neighborhood. Nope. Exposure meant you were taken outside the city limits and left to die. Usually, this job fell to a slave or servant. Imagine being that person carrying a crying infant out into the wilderness, knowing exactly what you're doing. The psychological weight of that must have been crushing. The most common locations were mountainsides, forests, or riverbanks. Places where wild animals might find you quickly, or where the elements would do the job. Some families chose spots near temples or public areas, hoping someone might find and adopt you. But that was more wishful thinking than reality. The sound of your crying would echo off the rocks as you're placed on the cold ground. Maybe wrapped in a blanket if the family felt generous, maybe not. The person leaving you would walk away quickly, not looking back, trying to pretend this was just another chore. And here's the thing, this wasn't done in secret or with shame. This was completely legal and socially acceptable. Some Roman writers even praised fathers who made difficult but necessary decisions about unwanted children. Let me ask you something. How do you think you'd handle living in a society where this was normal? Where your neighbors did this and nobody thought twice about it? It's a heavy question, but I think it's worth considering. Drop your thoughts in the comments. The nights were the worst part. Roman and Greek winters could be brutally cold, especially in the mountains. Summer wasn't much better. You'd have exposure, dehydration, and predators to worry about. But here's where it gets even more twisted. Sometimes families would leave tokens with the exposed children. Little pieces of jewelry, cloth fragments, or carved symbols. Why? So that if they changed their minds later, they could identify and reclaim the child. Imagine that moral arithmetic. We don't want to raise this baby, but let's keep our options open just in case our situation improves. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that's somehow both better and worse at the same time. Because not all exposed babies died quickly. Some were found by what we might call baby hunters. People who made a living collecting abandoned infants. Sounds like a rescue operation, right? Well, sort of. See, these weren't charitable organizations. These were business people who saw a market opportunity. Abandoned babies could be raised and sold as slaves. Healthy infants were particularly valuable because they could be trained from the very beginning. You're lying there on the hillside, maybe 12 hours old, when you hear footsteps. A figure approaches through the morning mist. For a moment, it might seem like salvation. The person examining you isn't looking for signs of life out of compassion. They're checking your market value. Are you healthy enough to survive the journey? Strong enough to be worth the investment of food and care for the next few years? If you pass this second inspection, you get scooped up and taken to what was essentially a baby farm. These operations existed throughout the Roman Empire and in Greek city-states. Large buildings where dozens of abandoned infants were raised together, fed the minimum necessary to keep them alive, and trained for whatever work seemed most profitable. The building smells like unwashed bodies, spoiled milk, and desperation. Dozens of children crammed into small spaces, crying, sleeping on straw mats, attended by the bare minimum of caregivers necessary to keep the mortality rate from being total. You'd grow up knowing nothing about your original family. No name except what your new owners gave you. No identity beyond your function. And at around age 4 or 5, you'd be sold to whoever needed a small slave. Some went to households as domestic servants. Some went to farms for agricultural work. Some went to workshops to learn trades. And some particularly attractive children went to purposes we won't get into in detail, but which were among the darkest aspects of ancient slavery. Let's talk about the specific places where this happened, because the locations tell us a lot about how these societies thought about life and death. In Rome, the most notorious location was the columna lactaria, the milk column. This was a pillar in the vegetable market where parents could abandon unwanted infants. The name came from the fact that nursing mothers sometimes came here looking for babies to adopt, often as wet nurses for their own children. But the columna lactaria was unusual because it was in the city center. Most exposure happened outside the city walls, in what Romans called the Ager Romanus, the Roman territory beyond the urban area. Think about what this means psychologically. To abandon your child, you had to physically carry them away from civilization. You had to walk past the boundaries of your community and into the wild spaces beyond. Picture yourself making that walk. You're carrying a bundle that might be crying, might be silent. Your footsteps echo on the stone-paved roads inside the city, then become muffled as you move onto dirt paths. The sounds of the city conversations, cartwheels, animals gradually fade behind you. The smell changes too. Less human habitation, more earth and vegetation. Maybe you catch the scent of wood smoke from a distant farm, or the musty smell of a forest floor covered in fallen leaves. In Greece, Mount Taygetus near Sparta was infamous for child exposure. The Spartans, with their obsession with physical perfection, made exposure of defective children essentially mandatory. Imagine climbing that mountain path, knowing what you're about to do, knowing that your society not only approves, but expects it. The mountain wind would be cold and constant, the rocks sharp and unforgiving. The view would be spectacular, rolling hills, distant cities, the blue Mediterranean in the distance. Beautiful country for hiking, terrible country for dying. In Athens, the Barathron, a deep pit outside the city, served a similar function. Originally used for executing criminals, it became a convenient place for disposal of unwanted infants. I want you to think about this for a second. These weren't random, chaotic acts. These were organized, systematic practices with designated locations and established procedures. This was how entire civilizations managed population control. How does that sit with you? Let me know in the comments how you're processing this information, because I know it's heavy stuff. Now we need to talk about something that makes this whole story even darker: the systematic preference for male children. You're born, and the first thing everyone wants to know is whether you're a boy or a girl. And if you're a girl, your chances of survival just dropped significantly. In Roman society, this preference was so strong that some families would keep multiple sons, but only 1 or 2 daughters. The historian Polybius wrote that it was common for wealthy families to raise all their sons but limit themselves to just 1 daughter. Why? Let's go back to that brutal economic math. Sons could work, fight, and carry on the family name. They could earn money, inherit property, and take care of their parents in old age. Daughters required dowries, massive financial investments that benefited another family, not your own. A decent dowry in ancient Rome could cost as much as a small farm. For middle-class families, marrying off a daughter could mean financial ruin. For poor families, it was literally impossible. So there you are, a baby girl, and your father is doing math that goes something like this. I can invest 20 years of food, clothing, shelter, and education into this child, then pay someone else a fortune to marry her. Or I can invest those same resources in my sons, who will actually contribute to the family's prosperity. From our modern perspective, this is horrific gender discrimination. From their perspective, it was rational resource allocation. The smell of olive oil and garlic fills the air as your father discusses your fate with the extended family. Maybe your grandmother argues for keeping you. Maybe your uncle suggests that daughters can be useful for making strategic marriages. But if the family is poor, if times are hard, if there are already other children to feed, the numbers were stark. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites shows that in some time periods and locations, male burials outnumber female burials by ratios as high as 3-to-1 among infants and young children. That's not natural mortality, that's systematic selection. Greek city-states were even more extreme. In Sparta, girls were exposed not just for economic reasons, but because they didn't fit the military-focused social structure. In Athens, the philosopher Poseidopus wrote, "Everyone raises a son, even if he is poor, but exposes a daughter, even if he is rich." Now, here's where things get interesting from an intellectual history perspective. Because it's not like everyone in the ancient world was cool with infanticide. Some of the greatest minds in history wrestled with this issue, and their arguments reveal just how complex and contested this practice was. Aristotle, who you probably know from philosophy class, actually defended exposure in certain circumstances. In his Politics, he argued that states should have laws limiting family size and requiring the exposure of deformed children. He saw it as a necessary tool for social stability. But Aristotle wasn't some heartless monster. He was trying to solve what he saw as a fundamental problem. How do you maintain a stable society when resources are limited and population growth is uncontrolled? Think about this for a second. One of history's most influential philosophers, a guy whose ideas still shape how we think about ethics and politics, thought infanticide was not only acceptable but necessary. How do you reconcile that with everything else we know about moral philosophy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those historical puzzles that doesn't have easy answers. On the other side, you had voices like Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher. Seneca wrote, "We drown even children who at birth are weakly and abnormal. Yet it is not anger, but reason that separates the harmful from the sound." Even when arguing against the practice, he framed it in terms of reason versus emotion. The very language reveals how normalized this was. The early Christians were among the first to systematically oppose infant exposure. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian documents, explicitly forbids it. "You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is born." But even Christian opposition took time to develop and wasn't universally accepted. Some early Christian writers struggled with the tension between their new faith and the practical realities of ancient life. Sensory detail, philosophical debate. Picture yourself in an ancient symposium. Oil lamps flickering against marble columns. Philosophers reclining on couches, wine cups in hand, debating the moral status of newborn humans like they're discussing the weather. The air is thick with incense and intellectual arrogance. These brilliant minds can calculate the circumference of the earth, write poetry that will survive millennia, and develop political theories that still influence modern governments. And yet they're calmly discussing whether it's acceptable to leave babies on mountainsides to die. Let's talk about how the law worked, because understanding the legal framework helps explain why this practice was so widespread and accepted. In Roman law, children didn't have independent legal status. They were essentially property of the paterfamilias, the male head of household. This wasn't just tradition. This was codified law that lasted for centuries. Under the 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code, fathers had absolute power over their children. They could sell them, disown them, or kill them without legal consequence. The phrase vita nescis potestas literally meant power of life and death. Think about how wild this is from our perspective. In modern law, parents are guardians of their children's rights. In Roman law, children had no rights that weren't granted by their fathers. A father could kill his adult son, and as long as it was done within the bounds of patria potestas, it wasn't murder, it was a family matter. A newborn baby had even less protection. Greek law was similar in many city-states, though with some variations. Spartan law actually required fathers to present newborns to state officials for inspection. If the officials deemed a child unfit, exposure wasn't just permitted, it was mandatory. The sound of legal proceedings fills the air around you. Arguments in Latin and Greek, the scratch of styluses on wax tablets, the authoritative voices of magistrates rendering decisions about property, contracts, and yes, the fate of children. But here's what's really interesting. While the law permitted infanticide, it also began to regulate it over time. Later, Roman law required that exposure happen within the first few days of birth, not weeks or months later. Why? Because extended infanticide was seen as cruel, even by ancient standards. The law also began to recognize property rights in exposed children. If you found and raised an abandoned baby, you had legal claim to them as a slave unless the original family reclaimed them and paid compensation. Religion played a huge role in these decisions, and not always in the way you might expect. Roman religion was intensely practical. The gods weren't moral authorities in the Christian sense. They were powerful beings who needed to be appeased to ensure prosperity and avoid disaster. When you were born, your parents weren't just thinking about economics and law. They were thinking about religious obligations, omens, and divine will. If you were born during an inauspicious time, during an eclipse, for example, or while bad omens were reported, this could influence your father's decision. Some dates were considered so unlucky the children born on them were almost automatically exposed. The temple smells of burning sacrificial meat and frankincense. Priests chant in rhythmic Latin, their voices echoing off stone walls decorated with painted scenes of gods and heroes. Your father might consult the august priests who read omens in bird flight and animal entrails before deciding your fate. These weren't random superstitions. This was the official religious apparatus of the Roman state. If the omens were bad, exposure might be seen not as cruelty but as a religious duty. Better to make the hard choice now than risk divine punishment later. Greek religion had similar elements. The oracle at Delphi sometimes gave advice about family planning and child rearing. Local shrines and festivals included rituals for blessing newborns and deciding which children were favored by the gods. But religion also provided some protection. Temples served as places of sanctuary, and some abandoned children were left at temple gates in hopes that priests would take them in. The goddess Rumina protected nursing mothers and infants. Juno Lucina watched over childbirth. These deities received prayers from parents hoping for healthy children and divine guidance about difficult decisions. It's fascinating to think about how the same religious system that could justify infanticide also provided the only social safety net available for abandoned children. Religion was simultaneously the problem and the solution. What do you make of that contradiction? How do societies develop belief systems that seem to contradict themselves? Drop your thoughts below. Let's get into some numbers, because the archaeological evidence tells us a lot about who survived and who didn't. Modern excavations of ancient cemeteries reveal patterns that are both predictable and shocking. In Roman Britain, for example, infant burial sites show that roughly 40% of children died before age 5. But when you break that down by gender and social class, the picture becomes more complex. Wealthy families lost about 25% of their children to natural causes. Poor families lost closer to 50%. But among the poor, female infant mortality was significantly higher than male infant mortality. That difference can't be explained by natural causes alone. You're walking through an excavated Roman villa site. The archaeologists have uncovered the family cemetery, and they're showing you tiny skeletons in equally tiny graves. Here's a male infant, buried with a small toy and a coin for the ferryman. Clear signs of natural death and family mourning. Here's a female infant of the same age, buried in a much simpler grave with no grave goods. The bones show no signs of disease or injury. She was healthy when she died. The archaeologist explains that this pattern repeats throughout Roman sites. Healthy female infants buried simply, while male infants, even sickly ones, receive more elaborate burials. Some sites show even more disturbing evidence. Mass graves of infants with no grave goods, no signs of disease, and obvious evidence of having died from exposure. In one site in Roman Gaul, archaeologists found over 100 infant skeletons in what appears to have been a communal disposal site. The demographic breakdown is stark: 75% female, 25% male, and these are just the ones who were formerly buried. Let me throw some numbers at you that might put this in perspective. In a typical Roman town of 10,000 people, roughly 400 children were born each year. Of those, maybe 250 survived to adulthood under normal circumstances. But when you add systematic infanticide into the mix, the numbers get much worse. Recent historical analyses suggest that in some periods, as many as 20 to 30% of all newborns were exposed. That means in our hypothetical town, 80 to 120 babies per year were deliberately killed. To put that in modern terms, imagine if every town the size of, say, A small college campus was systematically killing 100 infants every year, and everyone just ... considered it normal. Now, let's talk about what happened if you won the lottery and got to live. Because surviving the first few days was just the beginning of your challenges in the ancient world. If your father lifted you up and accepted you into the family, you entered a world that was simultaneously more dangerous and more structured than anything we can imagine today. Your first few years would be spent mostly with women your mother, if she survived childbirth, about a 10% chance she didn't. Wet nurses, female slaves, and other women in the household. Men weren't expected to have much involvement with small children. The household is a constant buzz of activity, the smell of bread baking, olive oil burning in lamps, and the less pleasant odors of human habitation without modern plumbing. As a small child, you'd spend your days playing with simple toys, wooden dolls, clay marbles, metal hoops. The floors are cold stone or packed earth, so you'd wear soft leather shoes or go barefoot. Discipline was harsh by modern standards. Roman and Greek parents believed that strict discipline produced strong character. Physical punishment was not only acceptable, but expected. The food you ate depended entirely on your family's social status. Wealthy children ate meat, fruits, honey cakes, and diluted wine. Poor children ate mostly bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables the family could afford. Disease was a constant threat. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no real understanding of how illness spread. Childhood diseases that we barely think about today, measles, whooping cough, diarrhea killed millions of ancient children. If you were from a wealthy family, you'd start formal education around age 6 or 7. This meant learning to read and write Latin and maybe Greek, basic mathematics, and if you were a boy, rhetoric and public speaking. Girls from wealthy families learned household management, weaving, and enough literacy to run a household. Boys learned skills they'd need for politics, business, or military service. If you were from a poor family, your education was whatever trade skills your parents could teach you. Most children started working by age 7 or 8, helping in the family shop, farm, or workshop. And if you were a slave, child either born into slavery or raised after being found as an exposed infant, your education depended entirely on your owner's needs. Some slave children learned valuable skills that eventually led to freedom. Others spent their entire lives doing manual labor. Here's where the story takes some interesting twists, because ancient literature is full of heroes who started life as exposed infants. The most famous example is probably Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. According to the myth, they were exposed as infants, but rescued and raised by a she-wolf. Pretty unlikely from a biological standpoint, but it makes for a great story. Oedipus, from Greek tragedy, was exposed as an infant because of a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out the way his parents hoped. These stories reveal something fascinating about how ancient people thought about fate, social mobility, and divine intervention. In the real world, exposed children who survived usually became slaves or, at best, adopted into families of lower social status. But in myth and legend, exposure often marked characters destined for greatness. The message seems to be that the gods could elevate anyone, even abandoned infants, to positions of power and importance. It was a way of reconciling the harsh realities of infanticide with beliefs about justice and divine will. But here's what's really interesting. These stories also served as a kind of social safety valve. They suggested that sometimes, just sometimes, the cruel decision to expose a child might be overruled by fate. Of course, the reality was very different. The vast majority of exposed children died within hours or days. Those who survived as slaves lived brutal lives with little chance of freedom, let alone greatness. But the myths persisted because they served a psychological function. They allowed people to feel that maybe, somehow, the children they abandoned might have destinies greater than the families they were born into. It's a beautiful story. It's also a convenient lie that made an ugly reality more bearable. What do you think about that? Do societies always create myths to justify their harsh realities? Are we doing the same thing today with our own difficult social issues? Let me know in the comments, because I think this pattern repeats throughout history in ways we might not even recognize. Let's talk about the business side of this, because where there were abandoned babies, there was inevitably someone trying to make money from the situation. The baby trade in the ancient world was sophisticated and organized. Professional child gatherers operated networks that spanned entire regions, collecting exposed infants and selling them in markets throughout the Roman Empire and Greek world. Picture an ancient marketplace, but instead of pottery and produce, one section is dedicated to human beings. Adults, teenagers, and yes, infants. The smell is overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, fear, desperation, and the practical odors of keeping many people in small spaces. The noise is a mixture of crying children, haggling customers, and sellers calling out the qualities of their merchandise. Infant slaves were particularly valuable for several reasons. They could be trained from birth, making them more obedient and skilled. They had no memories of freedom or another family. They could be molded to fit whatever role the buyer needed. Prices varied based on health, apparent intelligence, and physical appearance. A healthy infant might cost the equivalent of 2 to 3 months' wages for a skilled worker. An infant who appeared particularly intelligent or attractive could cost much more. The business model was relatively simple. 1. Collect exposed infants from known abandonment sites. 2. Provide minimal care to keep them alive. 3. Transport them to markets where demand was high. 4. Sell them to buyers who needed slaves for specific purposes. Some operators specialized in particular types of children. There were dealers who focused on finding attractive infants who could be raised as household slaves in wealthy families. Others looked for children who seemed strong enough for agricultural work. The most disturbing specialists focused on finding children for sexual exploitation. This was a real and documented part of the ancient slave trade, though it's an aspect that ancient writers and modern historians often glossed over. Moving infants across the ancient world was logistically complex. These were businesses that required wet nurses, food supplies, shelter, and protection during travel. Major routes connected areas where child abandonment was common with regions where slave labor was in high demand. Exposed children from overpopulated areas might end up hundreds of miles away, working on farms or in workshops where labor was scarce. The sound of cartwheels on Roman roads, crying infants, and the voices of slave traders discussing profit margins. It's a scene that played out thousands of times across the ancient world. The legal status of exposed children created some fascinating and horrifying legal complications that reveal a lot about how ancient societies thought about human rights and property. If you found an exposed infant and raised them, what were your rights? What if the original family changed their minds and wanted the child back? What if someone else claimed to have found the child first? Roman law developed elaborate rules to handle these situations. If you found and raised an exposed child, you had legal ownership of them as a slave unless the original family paid compensation for their care. The original family had a limited time period, usually 1 year, to reclaim an exposed child by reimbursing the finder for expenses. If multiple people claimed to have found the same child, the courts had procedures for determining the legitimate owner. The sound of legal arguments fills a Roman courtroom. Lawyers arguing about the property rights of human beings with the same dry legal language used for disputes over cattle or furniture. One famous case from Roman legal records involves a wealthy family that exposed a daughter during a period of financial difficulty. Later, when their situation improved, they discovered the child had been found by neighbors who raised her as a slave. The legal battle lasted 3 years. The birth family argued they retained parental rights. The adoptive family argued they owned the child as property due to their investment in her care. The court eventually ruled in favor of the adoptive family, on the grounds that exposure constituted abandonment of all parental rights. The birth family was ordered to pay compensation if they wanted to reclaim their daughter. The daughter, now 4 years old, had no legal standing in the case. She was the subject of the lawsuit, not a party to it. These legal frameworks reveal something disturbing about ancient conceptual categories. Children, particularly slave children, existed in a strange legal limbo between human beings and property. They had some protections under loaners couldn't kill slaves without legal justification, for example, but they also had none of the rights we consider fundamental to human dignity. The legal system treated questions about their ownership, sale, and treatment as purely economic matters. Their own preferences, relationships, or feelings were legally irrelevant. Think about how alien this legal framework is to our modern understanding of human rights. In our system, children have rights that exist independently of their parents' wishes. In the ancient world, children were essentially extensions of their father's property. How did entire civilizations develop legal systems that treated human beings as objects? And more uncomfortably, what aspects of our own legal system might future societies find equally horrifying? Now we need to talk about the people who are almost completely absent from ancient historical records on this topic: the mothers. Ancient literature, written almost entirely by men, rarely mentions what women thought about exposing their children. But the few glimpses we get suggest that this was often the most traumatic aspect of ancient motherhood. You've just given birth. You're exhausted, probably in pain, possibly suffering from what we'd now recognize as postpartum depression. Your hormones are flooding your system with protective instincts toward this tiny person you've carried for 9 months. And then your husband walks in and decides whether your baby lives or dies. The smell of blood and sweat still hangs in the air. Your body is telling you to nurse this child, to hold them close, to protect them from any threat. Every biological instinct you have is screaming at you to keep this baby safe. But you have no legal authority in this situation. No matter how you feel, no matter how desperately you want to keep your child, the decision isn't yours to make. Some Roman writers mention women who became melancholy or ill after their infants were exposed. These were probably what we'd now recognize as severe depression and trauma responses. The poet Ovid wrote about a woman who wept as though she were mourning the dead after her husband decided to expose their daughter. But even Ovid presented this as a touching but ultimately irrelevant emotional response, not a serious moral objection. There's evidence that some women found ways to resist or subvert their husbands' decisions. Archaeological findings suggest that some women secretly arranged for exposed children to be found by specific people, friends, relatives, or trusted slaves who would care for them. Others may have deliberately chosen exposure sites where discovery was more likely. Placing a child near a temple or a well-traveled road, instead of deep in the wilderness, could mean the difference between death and survival. Some women probably convinced their husbands to delay the decision for a few days, hoping that time or changing circumstances might alter the outcome. But these acts of resistance were dangerous. A woman who openly defied her husband's decision about child exposure could face severe punishment, including divorce, which would leave her destitute or physical violence. Think about the long-term psychological impact on women who lost multiple children this way. Some Roman and Greek families exposed several daughters while keeping their sons. What did that do to a mother's mental health? Ancient medical writers describe various women's ailments that might have been trauma responses to repeated child loss. But because they didn't understand psychological trauma the way we do, these symptoms were often attributed to wandering wombs or hysteria. The silence of women in historical records means we'll never know the full emotional cost of these practices. But the fragments we do have suggest it was devastating. Not all ancient societies handled unwanted children the same way. Let's take a tour of how different cultures approached this problem. In Sparta, child exposure wasn't just permitted, it was state policy. Every newborn was presented to the Gerousia Council of Elders for inspection. Weak or deformed children were taken to the Apothete, a chasm on Mount Taygetus, and thrown to their deaths. This wasn't seen as cruel, but as necessary for maintaining Sparta's military strength. The state needed warriors, not weaklings. The mountain air is thin and cold. The sound of wind through the rocks mingles with the echo of footsteps on the narrow path. State officials carrying out what they see as a patriotic duty. But here's what's interesting. Spartan girls, who survived the selection process, received better treatment than girls in most other Greek cities. Because Sparta needed strong mothers to produce strong warriors, girls got physical education, adequate nutrition, and some degree of social freedom. Athens had no state policy on child exposure, but it was widely practiced among all social classes. Interestingly, this was the same city that produced philosophy about ethics, justice, and the good life. The contrast is jarring. You could attend a lecture by Socrates about moral virtue in the morning, then walk past exposed infants on your way home in the evening. Athenian exposure sites were often near the city walls or in olive groves outside the urban area. The soil in these areas is rocky and pornot, good for farming but convenient for disposal of unwanted children. Roman Egypt had lower rates of child exposure than other parts of the empire, possibly due to Egyptian religious beliefs about the afterlife and the sanctity of life. Egyptian families were more likely to raise children of both genders, though they still practiced exposure during times of economic hardship. The hot, dry climate of Egypt meant that exposed children died quickly from dehydration, which may have made the practice seem more merciful than in climates where death took longer. Germanic tribes beyond the Roman frontier had their own practices. Tacitus wrote that Germanic peoples exposed fewer children overall, but were more likely to expose children born during certain times of year or under bad omens. The cold forested landscape of Germania meant that exposure was almost always fatal within hours. But Germanic religion placed high value on family loyalty, which may have reduced the overall frequency of the practice. Let's talk about something that connected the world of exposed children with the world of wealthy families: wet nursing. If you were a rich Roman or Greek mother, you probably didn't nurse your own children. That was considered undignified and potentially harmful to your health and appearance. Instead, you hired wet nurses, women who had recently given birth and could provide milk. But here's where it gets dark. Where did these wet nurses come from? Many wet nurses were women who had recently lost their own children, either to natural death or exposure. A woman whose own baby had been exposed or died might hire herself out to nurse the children of wealthy families. The economics were brutal but logical. If you were a poor woman who couldn't afford to raise your own child, exposing them and hiring yourself out as a wet nurse could provide income to support your older children. The smell of a wealthy nursery, expensive oils, clean linens, and the warm scent of milk and babies. But behind this comfortable scene is a wet nurse who may be grieving the loss of her own child while feeding someone else's. Some wet nurses were slaves who had been specifically bred for this purpose. Slave women who were good milk producers could be extremely valuable. They might nurse multiple children throughout their childbearing years, never keeping any of their own offspring. Ancient medical theory held that a wet nurse's character and health would transfer to the child through her milk. So wealthy families were very particular about whom they hired. Ideal wet nurses were supposed to be young but not too young, around 20 to 25 years old, healthy and strong, of good moral character, preferably having given birth to a son because male children were considered stronger. Some families interviewed multiple candidates and even had doctors examine their potential wet nurses. The process of hiring someone to feed your child was more rigorous than the process of deciding whether to keep the child in the first place. Think about the emotional complexity for these wet nurses. You're being paid to love and care for a child who isn't yours, while potentially grieving the loss of your own baby. Some wet nurses became deeply attached to the children they nursed and remained with families for years. Others maintained emotional distance as a survival mechanism. Ancient writers occasionally mention conflicts between mothers and wet nurses over child-rearing decisions. Who had more authority over a child, the biological mother who hired the wet nurse, or the woman who was actually providing daily care? These situations created intimate relationships between women of different social classes, but always within a framework of economic inequality and legal powerlessness. Now we get to one of the most significant turning points in this story: the rise of Christianity and how it fundamentally changed attitudes toward children and infanticide. Early Christians were among the first groups in the ancient world to systematically oppose child exposure. This wasn't just a minor theological point, it was a radical challenge to centuries of accepted practice. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian texts, explicitly states, "You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is born." This was revolutionary stuff. But early Christians didn't just preach against infanticide. They created the first organized systems for caring for abandoned children. Christian communities set up orphanages, foundling hospitals, and adoption networks. The smell of a Christian household in the 3rd century, simple foods, homemade candles, and the presence of children who might not exist in pagan families. Christian families were known for raising larger numbers of children, including adopted foundlings. But implementing Christian ideals in a pagan world wasn't simple. Christian families still lived under Roman law, still faced the same economic pressures, still had to function in a society where child exposure was normal and legal. Some early Christian families probably struggled with the tension between their religious beliefs and practical necessity. What do you do if you're a Christian family facing starvation and you simply cannot feed another child? Church records suggest that early Christian communities tried to solve this through collective responsibility. If a family couldn't afford to raise a child, the community would contribute resources or find another family to adopt them. This Christian approach was seen as weird and potentially dangerous by pagan neighbors. Romans and Greeks thought that raising too many children, especially girls, was irresponsible and could lead to social instability. Pagan critics argued that Christian families were weakening the empire by raising inferior children who should have been exposed. They saw Christian opposition to infanticide as evidence that the new religion made people soft and impractical. The sound of community gatherings where Christians debated how to implement their ideals in practice. These weren't abstract theological discussions, they were trying to figure out how to save actual children's lives. When Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, and especially when it became the official religion of the empire later in the 4th century, Christian attitudes toward children began to influence Roman law. Emperor Constantine made child abandonment more difficult by requiring official registration and providing state support for poor families. Later, emperors expanded these protections, but change was slow. Even after Christianity became dominant, child exposure continued in remote areas and during times of extreme hardship. Old practices die hard, especially when they're tied to economic survival. Let's step out of the ancient world for a moment and talk about how modern archaeology has revealed the scope and reality of child exposure in ways that ancient writers never could. When archaeologists excavate ancient sites, they find evidence that's both more systematic and more disturbing than what historical texts suggest. At Roman sites across Europe, archaeologists consistently find infant burial areas that show clear demographic patterns. In some cemeteries, male infant burials outnumber female burials by ratios as high as 4-1. This isn't natural mortality. When children die from disease or accident, the gender ratios are roughly equal. These skewed ratios are clear evidence of systematic female infanticide. The sound of excavation, careful scraping of tools against soil, the gentle brushing of ancient bones, the quiet voices of archaeologists recording measurements that reveal ancient tragedies. Some sites show even more direct evidence. Mass graves containing dozens of infant skeletons with no grave goods, no evidence of disease, and clear signs of having died from exposure. One of the most shocking discoveries came from Ashkelon, an ancient port city in Israel. Archaeologists excavating a Roman period bathhouse found a sewer system containing the remains of nearly 100 infants. Initial analysis suggested these might be children who died naturally and were disposed of in sewers. But detailed examination revealed something more disturbing. These were healthy newborns who had been killed and disposed of as waste. The demographics were stark. Roughly equal numbers of males and females, but DNA analysis suggested they were all related. This appears to have been systematic infanticide, carried out by people working in or connected to the bathhouse. Roman sites in Britain show similar patterns. At Uden Villa in Buckinghamshire, archaeologists found 97 infant skeletons in a well. The demographic breakdown and lack of grave goods suggest mass disposal of unwanted children. German sites along the Rhine frontier show evidence of Germanic and Roman practices mixing. Some burial grounds show Roman-style gender discrimination in infant burials, while others show more equal treatment that may reflect Germanic cultural influences. Archaeological evidence suggests that historical texts, disturbing as they are, may have actually understated the scope of infanticide in the ancient world. Written sources focus on legal and philosophical aspects, but they were written by educated elites who may not have fully understood what was happening among the general population. The bones tell a different story. They suggest that child exposure was more systematic, more widespread, and more demographically skewed than even the most detailed ancient accounts indicate. Modern forensic analysis can determine cause of death, age at death, and sometimes even family relationships between ancient remains. DNA analysis has revealed that some mass infant burial sites contain children from multiple families, suggesting organized disposal systems. Chemical analysis of bones can reveal nutrition levels, disease patterns, and environmental factors that help archaeologists understand the living conditions that led to these deaths. The clinical precision of modern science applied to ancient tragedy creates a strange emotional distance. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are the remains of real children whose deaths were someone's deliberate choice. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the Roman world was undergoing massive changes. Christianity was becoming dominant, the empire was fracturing, and social attitudes toward children were slowly beginning to shift. But change wasn't uniform or immediate. Even as official policy began to protect children, actual practice varied enormously by region, social class, and local tradition. Emperor Constantine's reforms in the early 4th century made the first serious legal challenges to patria potestas. Fathers could no longer kill their children with complete impunity, and child abandonment became more legally complicated. Later, emperors expanded these protections. Valentinian I made child exposure illegal in cases where the family could afford to raise the child. Justinian's legal code, compiled in the 6th century, included extensive protections for children and limitations on parental authority. But law and practice are different things. In remote provinces, far from imperial oversight, traditional practices continued largely unchanged. Economic changes also influenced child-rearing practices. As the Roman economy became more urban and trade-based, children's economic value changed. In cities, children could contribute to family income through apprenticeships and small-scale labor. But rural areas, where most people still lived, continued to face the same resource constraints that had always made large families a burden. The sound of changing times, less Latin, more vernacular languages, fewer classical references, more Christian imagery, less certainty about law and order, more reliance on local custom and religious authority. Different parts of the former Roman Empire developed different approaches to child welfare. In Italy and southern Gaul, Christian institutions like orphanages and foundling hospitals began providing alternatives to exposure. In Britain and northern Gaul, Germanic cultural influences introduced different family structures that were sometimes more protective of children. In North Africa and the Eastern Empire, older practices persisted longer, sometimes blending with Christian ideas in complex ways. The persistence of poverty, but here's the thing that modern people often miss. Legal reforms and religious changes didn't solve the underlying economic problems that drove infanticide in the first place. Families were still poor. Harvests still failed. Diseases still killed parents and left children orphaned. Women still died in childbirth, leaving infants without mothers. Christian charity and imperial welfare programs helped, but they were small-scale solutions to massive social problems. For many families, the choice was still between exposing a child and watching the whole family starve. As we move into the medieval period, we see the development of the first systematic alternatives to child exposure: institutional care for unwanted children. Monasteries and convents began accepting abandoned infants, not for adoption, but for raising within religious communities. This created the first large-scale alternative to family-based child-rearing in European history. Picture a monastery in 7th century Gaul. The morning bells ring across stone corridors that smell of incense, beeswax candles, and the simple foods of monastic life: bread, vegetables, and watered wine. In the scriptorium, adult monks copy manuscripts, while children, some orphaned, some abandoned, Some given to the monastery by families who couldn't support them learned to read and write alongside them. These children, called oblates, lived their entire lives within the monastery. They received education, food, shelter, and purpose, but they also gave up any possibility of normal family life or personal freedom. From our perspective, this seems limiting and harsh. From a medieval perspective, it was revolutionary, the first time in human history when abandoned children had a realistic chance of survival and even prosperity. One of the most ingenious medieval inventions was the ruota, or foundling willow, rotating wooden barrel built into the walls of monasteries and charitable institutions. Parents could place an unwanted infant in the wheel, ring a bell, and walk away. The wheel would rotate, bringing the child inside where religious personnel would take over their care. The system was designed to be completely anonymous. No questions asked, no names recorded, no judgment rendered, just a simple transaction. You provide a child who needs care. We provide that care. The sound of the bell, footsteps walking quickly away, and then the gentle rotation of wood on wood as another abandoned child enters the only safety net available. Some foundling hospitals became massive operations. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome, founded in the 12th century, eventually cared for thousands of children at any given time. These institutions developed sophisticated systems for wet nursing, medical care, education, and job training. They were among the largest and most complex charitable organizations in medieval Europe, but they also had staggering mortality rates. Even with institutional care, 50 to 70% of foundling children died before reaching adulthood. The difference was that now their deaths were from disease and malnutrition rather than deliberate abandonment. Before we conclude, let's step back and look at how other ancient cultures dealt with unwanted children. Because the Greco-Roman approach wasn't universal, Chinese culture had its own complex relationship with infanticide. Confucian ideals emphasized family continuity and filial piety, which provided some protection for children. But economic pressures and preference for sons led to practices similar to those in the Roman world. Chinese families were more likely to keep firstborn children regardless of gender, but later daughters were often abandoned or killed. The methods were different. Drowning was more common than exposure, but the underlying logic was similar. Hindu and Buddhist traditions generally opposed infanticide, but actual practice varied by region and social class. Some Hindu texts describe child exposure as a sin that would affect one's karma across multiple lifetimes, but economic necessity sometimes overrode religious prohibition. Archaeological evidence suggests that infanticide occurred in ancient India, though probably less systematically than in the Greco-Roman world. Aztec and Mayan cultures had very different approaches to children and family. Both societies valued children highly and had religious beliefs that made infanticide spiritually dangerous. Instead, these cultures developed sophisticated adoption systems and collective child-rearing practices that distributed the burden of raising children across extended family and community networks. Comparing different cultural approaches reveals that infanticide wasn't an inevitable response to resource scarcity. Societies found different solutions to the same underlying problems. Some cultures developed economic systems that made child-rearing less burdensome. Others created social structures that shared responsibility for children across larger groups. Still, others developed religious frameworks that made child killing spiritually unacceptable. The Greco-Roman approach systematic, legal, and socially acceptable infanticide was a particular solution that reflected specific cultural values about individualism, paternal authority, and the relationship between family and state. Understanding these different approaches helps us think about our own cultural assumptions. What seems natural or inevitable about family structures and child rearing is actually the product of specific historical and cultural choices. How do we handle unwanted pregnancies today? How do we support families who can't afford to raise children? How do we balance individual choice with social responsibility? The questions haven't changed that much. We've just developed different answers. Let's talk about something that's been lurking in the background of this entire story. How did people psychologically cope with living in societies where infanticide was normal? This isn't just academic curiosity. Understanding how entire cultures normalized practices we find horrifying helps us understand human psychology, social conditioning, and maybe even our own moral blind spots. Think about what it must have been like to live in a world where you could lose your own children to exposure, where you walked past abandoned babies on your way to work, where your neighbors made life and death decisions about newborns like they were deciding what to have for dinner. How do human minds adapt to that level of casual brutality? The answer seems to be through a combination of necessity, normalization, and psychological distance. First, normalization. When everyone around you accepts a practice, when it's legal, when it's discussed matter-of-factly in literature and philosophy, it becomes psychologically easier to accept. Ancient people didn't wake up each morning thinking, "I live in a society that kills babies." They woke up thinking, "I live in a society that makes hard but necessary decisions about resource allocation." The language they used reflects this psychological distance. Exposure sounds more clinical than infanticide. Making difficult choices sounds more reasonable than murdering children. Religious and philosophical systems provided additional psychological support for these practices. If you believe that the gods control human destiny, then children who die from exposure were probably fated to die anyway. If you believe that only the strong should survive, then exposure becomes a way of serving natural selection. If you believe that family survival is more important than individual survival, then sacrificing some children to save others becomes not just acceptable, but noble. But underneath all the cultural and psychological adaptation, there was real necessity. Most ancient families genuinely couldn't afford to raise unlimited numbers of children. When your choices are expose this child or watch my other children starve, the decision becomes much more understandable, even if it's still tragic. The smell of desperation isn't metaphorical. It's the smell of too many people in too small a space. Of food that's starting to spoil because you can't afford to waste any, of children who are already showing signs of malnutrition. Ancient people probably developed sophisticated emotional defense mechanisms to cope with child loss. Some parents probably maintained emotional distance from newborns until they were sure they would keep them. Some developed fatalistic attitudes that made loss easier to bear. Some channeled their grief into increased attachment to surviving children. These weren't heartless people. They were people trying to survive in a heartless world. Before we get too comfortable judging ancient societies, let's think about our own moral blind spots. What practices do we accept today that future generations might find horrifying? How do we psychologically cope with poverty, homelessness, and preventable diseases that kill millions of children worldwide? How do we normalize inequality that means some children have every advantage while others have none? How do we live with the knowledge that our lifestyle choices contribute to environmental destruction that will affect future generations? We've solved the problem of infanticide, but we haven't solved the underlying problems of resource distribution, social inequality, and competing claims on limited resources. So how did practices that lasted for over 1,000 years finally come to an end? The answer is complicated and took several more centuries to fully develop. The combination of Christian moral teaching, economic development, and legal reform gradually created alternatives to infanticide, but the process was slow and uneven. One of the biggest factors was economic development. As European societies became wealthier and more complex, children became economic assets rather than just burdens. In growing cities, children could work in crafts and trades from a young age. In developing agricultural areas, population growth was seen as a sign of prosperity rather than a threat to resources. The medieval church created the first large-scale institutions for child welfare: orphanages, foundling hospitals, and charitable organizations that provided alternatives to abandonment. These institutions weren't perfect, mortality rates were still high, and conditions were often harsh. But they represented the first systematic attempt to provide social safety nets for unwanted children. Legal systems slowly evolved to provide greater protection for children and limitations on parental authority. The absolute power of the Roman paterfamilias was gradually replaced by legal frameworks that recognized children as having some independent rights and protections. Perhaps most importantly, cultural attitudes toward children began to change. Medieval and early modern European cultures developed new ideas about childhood as a distinct phase of life, about the moral status of children, and about social responsibility for child welfare. This transformation didn't happen overnight. Even into the early modern period, child abandonment continued in times of economic hardship, but it was no longer seen as normal or acceptable. Was seen as a tragedy that society should try to prevent. Increasing literacy and education also played a role. As more people could read religious and philosophical texts for themselves, Christian teachings about the sanctity of life became more widely internalized. Educational institutions created new economic opportunities for children from poor families, making them potential assets rather than just burdens. Eventually, the demographic transition that accompanied economic development solved many of the underlying problems that had driven infanticide. As societies became wealthier, birth rates naturally declined. As medical care improved, fewer children died from disease. As economic opportunities expanded, families could afford to raise more children. The desperate resource calculations that had made infanticide seem necessary became less relevant as overall prosperity increased. So what can we learn from this dark chapter of human history? What lessons does the story of infanticide in the ancient world offer for our modern challenges? First, it reminds us that moral questions often involve competing values and genuine dilemmas. Ancient families weren't choosing between good and evil. They were choosing between different types of harm. Modern families still face resource constraints, still have to make difficult decisions about family size and resource allocation. We've developed better solutions than infanticide, but we haven't eliminated the underlying tensions. Second, it shows how important social institutions are for protecting vulnerable populations. Infanticide declined not just because people's moral views changed, but because societies developed alternatives. Modern child welfare systems, while imperfect, represent centuries of learning about how to protect children when families can't or won't care for them. Third, it demonstrates how powerful cultural normalization can be. Practices that seem obviously wrong to us were completely normal to intelligent, educated, moral people in different times and places. This should make us humble about our own moral certainties and curious about what future generations might think of our practices. Fourth, It reveals the complex relationship between economic conditions and moral choices. Material conditions don't determine moral values, but they certainly influence what moral choices are practically possible. Societies that want to uphold high moral standards need to create economic conditions that make moral choices feasible for ordinary people. Finally, it shows how institutions can gradually change cultural practices, even when individual attitudes are slow to evolve. The church, legal systems, and charitable organizations created new options that made old practices unnecessary. Modern institutions, governments, NGOs, international organizations have similar power to create new possibilities for addressing social problems. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, guys. From the moment of birth in ancient Rome to the gradual development of modern child welfare systems. From the brutal economics of survival to the slow evolution of human rights. It's been a heavy journey, and I appreciate you sticking with me through some really difficult material. When I first started researching this topic, I thought it would be a straightforward story about ancient cruelty versus modern enlightenment. But the reality turned out to be much more complex. The people who practiced infanticide weren't monsters. They were human beings facing impossible choices with limited options. They were trying to protect some children by sacrificing others, trying to balance competing moral obligations with insufficient resources. That doesn't make their choices right, but it makes them understandable. And understanding how good people can do terrible things is crucial for preventing those terrible things from happening again. We have made incredible progress. No modern society legally permits infanticide. We have international human rights frameworks that protect children. We have global organizations working to ensure that children everywhere have access to food, healthcare, education, and safety. Child mortality rates, while still too high in many parts of the world, are lower than they've ever been in human history. More children survive to adulthood, receive education, and have opportunities to build meaningful lives than at any previous time. But we're not done. Millions of children still die from preventable diseases. Millions more live in poverty, face violence, or lack access to education. Child trafficking, child labor, and other forms of exploitation still exist. We've solved the problem of systematic infanticide, but we haven't solved all the problems that made it seem necessary to our ancestors. So what can you do with this knowledge? First, support organizations that work to protect children worldwide. Whether that's local child welfare agencies, international aid organizations, or advocacy groups working on children's rights. Second, think critically about our own cultural blind spots. What practices do we accept today that future generations might judge harshly? How can we develop the moral imagination to see beyond our current assumptions? Third, remember that moral progress isn't automatic. It requires conscious effort, institutional support, and the willingness to make difficult choices in favor of vulnerable populations. The story of infanticide in the ancient world is ultimately a story about human beings trying to survive in difficult circumstances. It's a story about the power of economic necessity, cultural norms, and institutional structures to shape individual choices. But it's also a story about progress, about how societies can learn, evolve, and develop better solutions to persistent problems. We are not morally superior to ancient people. We're just lucky enough to live in societies that have developed better institutions and greater prosperity. Our challenge is to use that luck responsibly, to continue building a world where no parent ever has to choose between feeding one child and abandoning another. I want to hear from you in the comments. What struck you most about this story? What connections do you see to modern issues? What questions does it raise for you about moral progress and human nature? And if you found this deep dive valuable, please share it with others. These are the kinds of historical conversations that help us understand where we came from and where we might be going. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. It hasn't been easy, but understanding difficult truths about the past is essential for building a better future. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.